and welcome again. And I will turn it over to our wonderful presenters. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon.
Thank you, Anna. Bob, do you want to introduce yourself while I pull up my slides? And then I can do myself after.
Sure thing. Hello, folks. I'm Bob Machado from University of Maine Corporate Extension. I work, amongst other things, helping provide technical support for farmers and food business, trying to do anything related to food in the state of Maine. I give a focus on food safety, but I'm a food scientist, so I try to help folks with anything I can from a food science point of view. Sometimes some folks need help finding a good equipment for a specific thing they want to do at their farm or their processing facility. I have folks that like, hey, we're thinking about expanding. Could you take a look at our design to see the flow of the produce or the Twinkies or whatever is the food, so processing and farm. So whatever I can do from a technical assistance food science point of view, especially with a focus on food safety, I'll help you as part of my job with Cooperative Extension.
Thanks, Bob. And my name is Lindsay Warner, and I do the food safety inspections of farms that are subject to the federal produce safety rule regulation. And part of my job is also managing the contract that we have with the FDA to enforce the federal regulation. And part of that is conducting education and outreach to farms, which is what this is all about. And for the Ag Trade Show in Augusta, I put together a couple of workshops, and this was one of them on how to write a farm food safety plan. And this is predominantly focused on how to write a food safety plan to pass a gap audit. And we'll talk about more about that as we get into the slides, but there's a lot of different types of farm food safety plans that you could write, and some of them might not be meant to pass an audit like this one. And we can go through some examples of those later. So I'm going to run through these slides pretty quickly and then share a bunch of resources. And when I shared my presentation, it dominated all three of my screens. So I can't see anything else right now, but here we go. So a quick overview of what we'll be talking about this afternoon is why to write a food safety plan. What's the goal of writing a farm food safety plan? What's the difference between regulation and third-party audits? How to request an audit and how to prepare for an audit, the structure and basis of a regular gap audit specifically. We'll look at templates for farm food safety plans, and as well as some templates for records. And we'll talk about how to write a farm food safety plan without regurgitating the audit requirements. And when we start looking at some of these plan templates that are available, you'll see that they're writing, it's like teaching through a food safety plan for farmers. So there's a lot of extra information that doesn't necessarily need to be in there. So this workshop is not about learning the food safety practices. If you want to learn about those things, we recommend that you take the, yep.
Oh,
I think you need to start sharing your screen.
Oh, it's not sharing.
No,
One.
I wasn't sure if we're just giving an intro without sharing, but we are not seeing your screen yet.
I think it's because I hit that. Nope. Oh. Let's try this and just do screen one. And is it going? It's going now.
Working now.
it looks great.
I use my mouse. I swear one day I'll get this computer set up right. So I just read through this slide already, the workshop overview. And now we're on learning the food safety practices. And so the places to go do that is the Produce Safety Alliance Grower Training course. And we have one coming up May 1 and 2 that's going to be virtual. It might be the last offering that we do in Maine because of funding restraints. So I encourage anybody that's interested to take that course while they still can for, what is it, $25, Hob? Yeah, it's pretty affordable. I think that Hobbs Jumpstart program is full, and nobody else can get into that. So that might not be an option, but until July of this year, 2025, we're still doing on-farm readiness reviews. If a farm is interested, and that goes over, it's like an introduction to the produce safety rule regulation, and we talk farm food safety practices. And farms that have already done one of those can have us out to do just a technical assistance visit. If there's any specific questions you want to talk about that your situation on your farm. I have a website, and part of that website is a library of resources. So there's a lot of farm food safety information there. And I've got a slide later with some other resources as well. So why is it a good idea to write a farm food safety plan? If you're going to do an audit, because you have a buyer that's requesting that you have an audit certificate, you have to have a farm food safety plan. But they can also be a really good reference for employees, and you can use them as a training tool, so they can be helpful that way. They definitely demonstrate that your farm has a commitment to food safety, so it looks good to auditors and regulators if you have a food safety plan. And they can also be useful tools, an emotional support tool specifically. If you're in the middle of an inspection or an audit, you can lean on that food safety plan to help you answer questions and stay on track. And if, hopefully this never happens, but if your farm is ever involved in a foodborne illness investigation, it shows that your farm took due diligence to protect the consumers that are eating your food. They can also help you free up your time during an inspection or an audit. So a lot of people don't have a huge staff on their farms, and so something might come up that needs your attention. And if you have a farm food safety plan, you can leave your auditor with the food safety plan, and they can still be capturing information that they need while you're off taking care of something else. So it moves things along quite efficiently. It also gets the knowledge that you have stored in your head on paper, and that's really great, so that if there's ever an event where you are not around and somebody needs to find something out, they can reference the food safety plan. And it documents the work that you are doing. And so as a regulator, what we say is if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. So it's good to write those things down, and a food safety plan is intended to capture what you're doing. So the goal of writing a farm food safety plan is to conduct an assessment so that you can reduce the risks on your farm that can't be eliminated. You're outside growing in the soil. It's not a sterile environment, so there's going to be risks. But going through the process of writing a farm food safety plan makes you think about those risks and how you minimize them on your farm. So you've identified what the risks are, and you have a plan to minimize them to the best of your ability. And a farm food safety plan also demonstrates to an inspector and auditor that you are doing your best to control those risks, and that's all documented, and helps you stay organized so that you don't miss anything important. And so I just want to be very clear, because there's a lot of confusion surrounding this, but I do produce safety rule inspections, and there is no food safety plan required for farms that are subject to that regulation. So, but they are required if you're going to do a third-party audit, which is the next slide. So just to be clear about what the produce safety rule is, it's a federal regulation. If you want to know more about that, you can do an internet search for 21 CFR 112, that's Code of Federal Regulations, and you can pull up the regulation and read it away to your heart's content until you fall asleep, because it's very boring. We only do inspections once every 3 to 5 years, and those inspections are mandatory if your farm is subject to the regulation, but they do not cost any money at all. And there's a few record requirements for the produce safety rule, but not nearly as many as a gap audit. And it's only looking at biological hazards. So those are your viruses, bacteria, and parasites, and not of any of the other classes of hazards, which we'll see here. So a third-party audit is something that's voluntary. So your farm requested it because your buyer will not buy your produce unless you have a certificate. And so one thing that audits require is a written food safety plan. And those audits are going to look at biological hazards as well as chemical and physical hazards. So they'll include things like glass breakage and pesticide application, all of those things, as well as just biological hazards. So again, they're very record heavy, and audits cost a lot of money. The cost goes up every year, it seems. And so in Maine, you can request a USDA Agricultural Marketing Service GAP audit. So we do regular GAP audits and we do harmonized GAP audits. And there's other USDA audit standards that we don't do. So these are the ones that we do. It saves farms a little bit of money when you have somebody that's already in Maine traveling to your farm rather than somebody from USDA who's out of state, because you're paying for your travel to do it. When you do request an audit, you want to make sure that you request a specific audit that your buyer wants, because there's so many of them, and some of them want a certain audit and only parts of that audit. And so it's important to hone in on what you need so that you're not paying for extra or the wrong thing, and then you can't sell your produce where you thought you would be able to sell it. That would be really too bad. And so once I get through the slides, we'll look at the packet that Annie emailed out to everybody. Has an example of a food safety plan that I wrote, and has a tip sheet on how to request an audit. And so when you're preparing for an audit, I really encourage people to go to the USDA AMS website to check for updates. And so that's the farm's responsibility. So nobody will notify farms, even if you've had a whole ton of audits. We've audited your farm every year. It's not our responsibility to notify you if there's been any changes to the system. So everybody should, first thing in the season, is check out the USDA website, see if there's any updates that you should be aware of before you have your audit for the season. And you can also, on the USDA website, find the current audit checklist. So they've been modifying these quite regularly. So it's important to make sure you have the most up-to-date audit checklist. And that's the questions that the auditor will go through. And the audit standard doesn't change as much, but it does. So it's good to check the standard. And the standard is different from the checklist, and that it's the instructions to the auditor and to the farm on how the question should be answered. And there's other resources on the USDA website that are worth checking out too. Just a little bit behind the structure and basis of what a regular audit looks like. So there's good agricultural practices, which is what GAP stands for. And those are made up of the general questions. So these are required at the start of every audit. An audit will always include the general questions. And then part one is farm review. Part two is field harvest and field packing activities. So if you sell to Hannaford in Maine, these are the two parts that they are going to require. And they usually don't ask for parts 3 and 4. And that's why it's important to make sure you're asking for what you need. So parts 3 and 4 are about house packing, your packing house, and storage and transportation. So those are good handling practices. Now we're moving away from agricultural activities to handling food after you've harvested it. And then just to make things a little more confusing, they throw in some GMPs, and these are good manufacturing practices. Also the basis for food safety in general. And these come from a federal regulation, 21 CFR 117. This used to be 21 CFR 110, which is what you'll see in the standard, but they're the same thing pretty much. So even though farms are not subject to that regulation, that's kind of the best practices for food safety that a lot of things are based on. And if you go through and look at the audit standard, you'll see that there's a part 6 and a part 7 in there on warehouse distribution centers and food defense. So those have been removed and are no longer offered. And so if your buyer wants something like that, they'll be asking for a good manufacturing practices audit, and that's not something that USDA does anymore. And if you go through the audit standard, there it references so many regulations, and I just put a few down here as reference. But there's OSHA regulations, EPA regulations, FDA regulations. So there's a lot lumped into an audit standard. So I think the easiest thing to do is just to read through the standard rather than diving in deep into all these different regulations. And I think the first step, a good thing for anybody to look at, is the FDA Guide to Minimize Microbial Food Safety Hazards for Fresh Fruits and Vegetables. This is like the OG original document that started food safety on farms. So it's readable. It's not too long, so that's a great place to start if you really want to get a sense for what you're supposed to be working on. I've included this slide because we were giving some pesticide credits for the workshop, but just a heads up to everybody, it's a good reminder that in Maine, you do need a pesticide applicator license if you're selling more than $1,000 worth of produce annually, and you apply any EPA registered pesticide, and that also includes, ironically, unregistered minimum risk pesticides. And so these apply to when you're applying it to produce, when it's growing, when you're washing it, when you're storing it. And this even applies to OMRI listed organic pesticides. So organic are not exempt. And minimum risk pesticides are those that have like natural ingredients that are making a claim. And usually they'll have precautions for applying them, like don't get it on your skin because it could burn your skin slightly and stuff like that. So that's why the applicator license is required still. And so just a warning about food safety plan templates. There's a lot of different formats you'll see when we start looking at some of these, and there is not one format that's required or better than the others. It's all personal preference. And the examples that I pulled for this workshop came from the Produce Safety Alliance website, and that's the link right there. And when I dove into all these different templates, I was very confused because they didn't say what they were. So some of them were templates for a harmonized audit, and some of them were for regular GAP, and some of them were a food safety plan template that wouldn't pass an audit. And some of them are templates for the produce safety rule that doesn't even require a plan. So it's so confusing, but I tried to make some sense of it so you could go through quicker with the links and have an idea of what you're looking at on one of the attachments that Anna sent out before the course started. I think I've talked about how none of these are the bare minimum, and I've got another slide coming up about that. But I do want to point out again, just to highlight that if you, the best way to get through writing a food safety plan is to take the grower training. That will help you. There's a whole module on writing a farm food safety plan in that grower training, and then knowing the audit standard will help you get through that. So here's some examples of the different formats that you'll see from the plans that are on the Produce Safety Alliance website. Some of them have an international standards numbering system that can look like the audit questions, but don't match up if you look far enough. Some of them are organized by audit question, and this can be really handy for an auditor, but maybe less useful for the farm. Some of them are by topic, some of them are fillable, some of them are checklists, and then you can write in, details here and there about your farm. And some of them have instructions that you delete out once you type in your farm information. Historically in Maine, down in southern Maine, there's been a lot of farms that used Ag Matters plan. So Linda Titus was a consultant that worked for a really long time. So a lot of farms have worked with her and have her farm food safety plan. And then up in northern Maine and Potato Land, there's Steve Johnson's plan. I have not seen this one personally, but it's pretty specific to potato farms. So those are the ones that kind of been in use in Maine for a long time. And so here I want to talk about like the bare minimum, and because I can't share more than one thing at a time, we'll get to the packet in a minute. But in the packet, there's a checklist, the checklist for the regular GAP audit. And if you go through the checklist, you'll see that there's a D or a P or an R next to most audit questions. And this means that the audit question requires a document, a written policy, or a record to satisfy the question. So something in writing. And if you don't have anything in writing, then you don't get those audit question points. And you can eliminate a lot of what you put in your fire and food safety plan if you don't include the audit questions that don't have one of these letters. And so I have an example of this. So question G8, it says to do. So these questions are the ones, if they don't have a letter next to them, the auditor is just gonna look at your farm and make sure that you're meeting that audit question. So nothing written. But audit question G8 says that readily understandable signs are posted to instruct employees to wash their hands before beginning or returning to work. And so that's just something visually confirmed. But if you look at some of these templates, Linda's plan includes it in the field harvest log. Stephen Johnson's plan includes it in the hygiene, safety, and illness section, and the Henderson plan includes it as well. So all of these templates are including information that's doesn't need to be in there because it's something an auditor would just visually confirm. So a few more tips about sticking to the bare minimum. I have a list of records that would need to be attached to the food safety plan template that I created. They're listed in the workshop packet that I'll run through. And the reason that I focused on the bare minimum is because auditors are trained to hold you to what your food safety plan says. And so you really need to make sure that you're doing what your farm food safety plan says you're doing. And having a short plan makes the audit go faster, which makes it more affordable for you. So in the packet that I put together, I made general policies for parts 1 through 4. And so these are pretty straightforward and applicable to most farms and probably don't require much tweaking. And I did this so that if you are writing a farm food safety plan, you could focus on the parts that are really important to having good practices on your farm. And so the big one is employee training. In my opinion, workers are the biggest risk on your farm. And so it's worth putting a lot of effort into your food safety employee training program. Watching your employees, making sure they're comfortable reporting to you if they see something that's not right, or if they made a mistake or anything like that. So definitely worth putting some time into this. And I have a blurb here about writing standard operating procedures. And so these are not required even for an audit, but they're helpful for employees to follow. So this could be something like how to mix up sanitizer solution. And so maybe there's somebody that does that all the time, but that person's not there that day. So having a standard operating procedure posted can help other people fill in the gaps. And I want to point out that if you want to write standard operating procedures, there's a lot of templates for these that have like special formatting, and none of that is required. There's no required heading. You don't have to have a purpose or any of these other things. All you're doing is writing a recipe or steps for how you do a task. That's all a standard operating procedure is. And so we don't get to have activity time today, but I'm going to go through these last few things, and then I'll start sharing some templates and talking through that. Employee training is a good thing to focus on. And then equipment and general cleaning is another important part that you should focus on your farm. And so a strategy for when you're going to work on your equipment and general cleaning program is to list out all the food contact surfaces that you have on your farm and then group them by the method and frequency of cleaning. And so you can lump these things together and write like one procedure for how you clean all these pieces of equipment and a different procedure for how you clean all these different pieces of equipment. So it can be a amount of writing you have to do when you can lump things together. And then you would, once you have that list, you would write up how you clean that equipment and make a cleaning schedule, which is required for a farm food safety plan. And see, this is me throwing in little tips, just like happens with the food safety plan template. So just a reminder not to pressure wash when you're packing or reusing uncleanable containers or chemical containers. And all these little tidbits are what get thrown into food safety plan templates and kind of bog them down with extra information. And so a previous land use assessment is something that has to be specific to the farm, and a water assessment is another thing that is specific to a farm. So employee training, previous land use assessment, and water assessments are the three things that you need to focus on the most when you're writing a food safety plan. And I will talk through my little assessment template for pre-harvest water. This is very different than what's required for the produce safety rule, so it's quite basic for these purposes. But I did want to point out that for all the farms, when I did gap audits that were using the Linda Titus plan, she has a statement in there that the farm does or does not adhere to the recreational water standard of 126 generic E. coli per 100 milliliter of water. And so this is not a gap requirement. And so sometimes we had farms that were in non-compliance with their farm food safety plan because they said that they were following this. But then when I looked at their water test results for the stream that they were using to irrigate their crop, the results were higher than 126. And so that turned into an audit hit. So you need to be really sure that you're looking at your water test results and following your food safety plan so that you can take corrective action when you need to. Whoops. And so before I go through my little water assessment exercise, just some questions to be thinking about if you're going to do a water assessment. So you want to make sure that you're looking at your water test results and interpreting them. You want to think about how you determine the appropriate use of your water sources. I do want to point out that microbial reduction by commercial washing has to be supported by a study specific to the farm. So I'll talk about die-off in a little bit, but you can't use that for commercial washing. You could use that between the last application of water and harvest. There is science out there to support that, and you'll see that in the assessment that I'm going to share. And that's referenced directly in the current version of the grower training manual, and you can use it. I'm not sure what the next version of that's going to look like. And there's another instance of microbial die-off between harvest and end of storage, and that's the same as the commercial washing. You'd have to support that claim with a scientific study specific to your farm. So I'll run through these other resources. This is the last slide on here. A lot of the templates and records that I pulled come from the Cornell-CAL's National GAPS program, and any farm that's going to have an audit should definitely check out this resource because that can help you get through the audit. There's a lot of information there. Farm food safety begins on the farm. I think a lot of farms got, not a lot of farms, I think a lot of universities got grant money to do these farm food safety begins on the farm programs. So Cornell and UC Davis has one. The Produce Safety Alliance is part of Cornell-CAL's, and they have a ton of resources on their website, a little bit more catered to produce safety rule compliance. The NECAFS, that's the New England Center to Advance Food Safety, has a food safety clearinghouse. And so all sorts of resources that have been peer reviewed are posted to that website. So you can search through and find something that you know is a reputable source rather than just a random internet search. And research is something I'm just starting to dive into, and we've been focusing on it a lot next winter. So I threw up some sources of where you can look into some research. USDA has an agricultural research library. UC Davis does a ton of research and posts it all on their website. And the USDA has the Ag Research Service, which I think loops you back to the Ag Research Library, but I'm not sure. So that's the end of the slides. I guess we can pause there and see if there's any questions, and then I can start sharing other stuff.
Thank you, Lindsay. Any questions from the group at this point? In the chat or out loud? We're a small group, so I think it's okay to just ask if you'd like.
Sure. And if maybe people are nervous about the whole recording part, we can turn that off and do questions at the end too. That'd be fine. Okay. So I'll take another stab at sharing. Hob, you don't have anything you want to jump in about?
Nope, not yet, but I will at some point for sure. Hello.
Okay. Um,
Well, while you look for that, I'll mention something that I heard before is it could look like a daunting process to put this document together, but I have a friend that in one of our last conference, she mentioned something that I'm paraphrasing, but even a badly written farm food safety plan is better than no farm food safety plan. So don't worry too much. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So if you feel like just putting something on paper, just start. You'll be way ahead of people who doesn't even try. That's my very woo-woo kind of approach, but it's true.
no, thanks, Hob. I think that's
Wise advice. We did just get one question.
Oh.
If you want to talk about that briefly in the chat. The question is, does all of this information apply as well to roadside stands?
No. So farm food safety plan, especially specifically this one that's written for passing a gap audit, it is something that you would do to satisfy a buyer requirement. So if you were selling to Hannaford, Hannaford would tell you, we would like your local produce, but we can't buy it from you unless you have a gap audit for parts 1 and 2. And so in Maine, there's no license required to sell produce on the side of the road. And there's no audit requirement. So you could, have a farm food safety plan that's written to help you and your employees, that's not, tailored to passing an audit. And I would recommend that, but it's definitely not a requirement. Produce safety rule, you don't have to worry about that unless your produce sales are over 32,000 a year. And even then, if you're selling locally, you're likely exempt from inspection. So yeah, not a whole lot of people have to worry about this stuff. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other? Just interrupt me. I'm deaf, so you got to yell at me. So I'm just gonna walk through the farm food safety plan that got emailed out to everybody. And this is my packet. This is kind of my intro on how, if I was doing a farm food safety plan, how I would do it. So this is just the cover sheet. We're gonna scroll through this. And the second page is like the tip sheet on how to request an audit and how to prepare for an audit. So here I give the content for the Presque Isle staff that do all the scheduling for the gap audits. And then I have links for the audit checklist, whether you're doing a regular gap audit or a harmonized gap audit. And I've got a link to the standard. The standard for regular gap is very hard to find. I think USDA desperately needs to update it and they haven't yet, so it's buried in their website, which is a little too bad, but it's there somewhere and we can look at that next. And just a few tips. And then what I did was I took the audit checklist for the regular gap audits the general questions, and then parts 1 through 4. And I broke them up by whether they require a document, record, or policy, or if they're just visual questions that an auditor would be looking at. And so it doesn't matter too much about if it's a D, P, or R, policies or records, and you'll P is for policy, and you'll see that I wrote a bunch of generic ones. And so all of these audit questions require paperwork. And this question 1, 2, and 1, 1, 1 and 1, 2, you'd have to write in, what's your source of irrigation water? That's why there's no record there. That's something that you do as part of your assessment, and how crops are irrigated. We'll scroll through. And like I said, farms selling to Hannaford usually don't have to do parts 3 and 4, but I included them just because somebody might need them down the road. And then these questions do not have a D, P, or R over in that right-hand column. So these are the ones that the auditor will observe, and these do not need to be written in the food safety plan. And so what I would encourage people to do, if you're not going to have them written in your plan, is to just before the audit starts, do a self audit of your farm, a few days before, and make sure that you have all your ducks in a row. And you could just run through all these audit questions and make sure that, all of your employees are trained and following good practices, that you've got your signs posted, that light bulbs are protected so they don't break and contaminate produce in the fields or in the storage areas. So a bunch of visual questions, again, that do not need to be written down. This farm food safety plan cover sheet, this has you write down information that's collected at the start of every audit. So it's handy to have it written and ready for your auditor so you don't have to go find it. A lot of audits that I did, the audit time was extended because they didn't have a list of all the different field locations that I needed for the audit. So it's handy to have that all in one place. This page is the Farm Food Safety Plan attachments. So these are all the records that you would have to attach to this plan template that I'm going through right now, if they were applicable to your farm. So you'll see like a farm map, and a farm map can really help an auditor be efficient so they can get a general idea of the layout of your farm and make sure that they don't forget anything, so that we don't have to take more audit time going back to see something that was forgotten. Excuse me. So that's just a list of records to make sure you have, and you can see that I've written in next to them the audit question that requires these records so that you could go back to that question in the checklist very quickly. And so this is the start of my generic policies, and I'm not going to read them all. These are all the audit questions that have a P next to them for policy required. And I tried to write these very generically so that they could be broadly applicable to all farms. There's a few of them that they're highlighted in gray, and that means you'd have to write in some additional information to make it specific to your farm. So you can see under toilet facility cleaning policy, toilet facilities are cleaned at the specified frequency, and you could write in here, like, we do that weekly or daily or whatever you do on your farm. So there's visitor policies, health and hygiene policies, illness policies, injury, bodily fluid. What do you do if somebody gets cut in the for the produce or wherever? What to do if there's a toilet leak or a sewage spill? Soil amendments. Are you using any raw manure or just composted, treated soil amendments? Glass breakage, harvest container policies. So we don't want people putting personal items in harvest containers. I've seen that a lot on audits. So that is something that's an actual policy and not supposed to be done on a farm. Traceability policy for that, work and domestic animals. Hair restraints, you'll see that hair restraints are not required unless you're doing parts 3 and part 4. So not something that needs to be done for a Hannaford audit, for just parts 1 and 2. Jewelry, if there's any opened or spilled product, and then conveyances for shipping. And that last one, conveyance inspection and loading policy, is another one where you'll see the gray highlighted text, where you'd have to write in some information specific to your farm. And here I have a list of required worker training topics. And so I've got the topic and then where in the audit standard you'll find the requirement to train your employees on these topics. So this can be used like a checklist to make sure that you hit all of the topics required for employee training. We do interview employees during audits. So it's helpful for them to know this stuff and be refreshed kind of close to the audit so they have it sharp in their mind. And then this last page is those parts of the food safety plan that I mentioned before that are worth putting a little extra effort into them. And so that's cleaning food contact surfaces and having a schedule for all of the cleaning in your facility, previous land use assessments, assessments. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time on previous land use assessment. That's basically if you've been using the cropland for more than 5 years, it's generally accepted that you don't have to worry about anything. It's opening up new land for farming where you want to pay a little more attention, like was it concentrated dairy cattle area before. And if that's the case, you might have to do some soil testing to see if there's a high load of microorganisms associated with the dairy cattle in the soil, that kind of stuff, or if there's any chemical concerns. What you won't see in a lot of the templates require like an adjacent land use assessment, and that's not specifically called out in the GAP audit standard. So I just stuck to what it says specifically, which is previous land use, a soils assessment only. Food contact surface and cleaning policies. That's a whole different workshop in and of itself that I'm working on. That will be the third one. So come to that workshop if you want to learn more about that, I guess. And water assessments, I'll pop over to the assessment example that I have. But basically, because there's a whole bunch of different regulations that are included in GAP audit, some of those are worker protection standards. And so that's where the requirement to have potable water, drinking water for your workers comes from. But that water also is required to be used for like hand washing or washing equipment, washing produce after you harvest it. Pre-harvest water, you can have a little more lenient water quality with that, depending on how you use the water source. And then if you're using wash water, there's some additional considerations for temperature. And if you're treating that water, how you change the water change schedule and how you test them to monitor the treatment. I'm gonna stop sharing this one and see if there's any questions about that while I pull up the next one.
Thank you, Lindsay. Any questions either in the chat or out loud are great.
All right, if nobody interrupts me, I'll just keep going. So this is an example of a water assessment that I put together, and some of these, not all of them, but some of these water results that I have in here are from actual GAP audits that I did. So these are real water test results that I've seen in Maine. And I think I'm gonna skip ahead over here. On the back side, I have like you could do your own assessment on your farm, but what I did on the back side, because I had more space, was I did the map out for the die-off. And so die-off is generally a half log reduction a day, and I've forgotten how to do logarithms, but I can do percents. And so that's roughly equivalent to a 68% die-off per day. So 32% are remaining. So I did the math out here just to kind of show you how high the microbial counts can be to still use the water safely if you have enough time between the last application before harvest and harvest. And this is not something that we should be needing to rely on to use water safely in Maine, because we are so lucky to have pretty good quality water in Maine. I don't normally see water results high enough where you'd have to do a 4-day die-off. So basically how it goes is that if your microbial counts were below 394, after 1 day of die-off, that would bring you down to the 126, which is the upper threshold of the recreational water standard, which is the best science we currently have for determining if water is safe for irrigation use. So theoretically, if your water is safe to swim in because it has less than 126 generic E. coli in there, it's safe to irrigate the day of harvest. I think that might be cutting it kind of close, but that's the best science we have to go off of right now. So 2 days die-off would be adequate as long as your generic E. coli was below 1200. And I've only seen one water test above that in all the GAP audits that I've done. 3-day die-off if your generic E. coli is below 3800, and 4-day if your generic E. coli is below 12,000. And so I think that this topic garners a lot of like nervousness when we do the grower training, but again, not something I think people really need to be concerned about in Maine. Generally, we've got pretty safe water. But here I have some different water sources and some different scenarios. And so the first one is a
Lindsay?
stream. Yep.
Before you dive into that, someone is curious if you can share what die-off means.
Okay, so die off, thank you, is so let's say you had, I'll go back over here. Let's say you did a water test because a GAP audit requires you to test the water that you're using on your farm. And so if you had a well that you were testing and it was like a good condition well, drilled and capped, and you were using it for drinking water, that would have 0 generic E. coli in it, right? But you don't ever see that with surface water because it's open to the environment and there's birds flying over and all sorts of stuff. And so you'll get generic E. coli counts in surface water sources, farm ponds, rivers, all sorts of different water sources. And so what die-off is that when you apply that water to the crop, and it's exposed to UV irradiation and temperature and it dries out, those conditions kill off some of the generic E. coli that was in that water sample over time. It never entirely goes away, but the populations will drop off pretty rapidly, and then they'll just hang around in the environment in kind of the background over time. And so what die-off is relying on enough days between application to the crop and harvest to allow for some of the generic E. coli in that water to die off. That's what that is. But again, I don't think farms in Maine should have to rely on this. It's a nice tool to have in your pocket. So if something happens and maybe there's like a sewage discharge that happened for, a month prior to your harvest and you're trying to figure out if that's been enough time to use the water safely, there's some different situations that might pop up where it would be useful to have this so that you know with some confidence that you can still use your water source safely, even though you had some kind of a situation.
Yeah,
that,
can I just add a little bit, Lindsay?
please do.
I think that as much as Lindsay said, this is a tool. It's nice to know if at some point you get some water tested and the results are not as good as you expected, to know that you can just take let's just say a discount on that number if you give enough time between when you applied and when you harvest. But you should not think of this like, oh, it's okay to have up to 12,000 if I only ever harvest 4 days after I irrigate. So don't look from that side that this is almost like once in a while you can use this, but it's there for you to justify, as an example, why did you destroy all your crop, right? If the numbers were high, but they were not that high, you can use this idea that we know that over time, some of the bacteria will die. So you are probably more safe than not if the numbers are within those day off numbers there. And I will just answer again a question that was asked on the chat, just for folks that maybe don't have access to chat, but someone asked if there are requirements for testing the produce itself. And there is not regarding for produce safety rule. I'll let Lindsay answer if there are any for GAP. I don't think that is. But the one case where there could be, if a buyer just asks you that you need to test, then it's kind of up to you to take with the buyer. If you want to sell them and they tell you that they are only going to buy if you test your produce, then you might have to, but very uncommon. I haven't seen that much here in Maine with small farms. A little bit more common if you go to the green belt in the West Coast where they grow tons and tons of the same produce. They might test and they might have their own farm policies for testing, but there are no requirements according to the produce safety rule. Again, so no requirements for testing the produce itself, and die off. Some of the bacteria will die, so you might have a little bit of leeway between when you apply that water, when we harvest, but don't expect to be using that all the time. Leave it as a wild card to use once in a while. My 2 cents.
Thanks, Hob. got too many screens going to monitor the chat, so I appreciate it.
And a new question came in. Is E. coli the only item of concern? What about arsenic? Do you have something to say about that, Lindsay?
I do. And so this is microbial considerations. And so like arsenic it's a toxic mineral, I believe, that could be in the water. So if you're applying that to the crop, like there's not going to be enough that sticks onto that produce where it's going to make somebody sick from ingesting the produce. So there's a difference between drinking water standards and irrigation water standards, right? Because you're not consuming as much of the water because it was just applied to the crop. And so that's different volumes. And so that's why for irrigation water, we're focusing on microbial levels because that's really the biggest risk. And then like standards for arsenic will be in your drinking water standards because that's where it's more likely to be a problem. To me. You agree, Hub?
Yes.
Yeah, he's muted. Okay. And then just let me know if there's any other ones. The die-off. So for me, the die-off, not standards, but guidelines, they are not a guarantee. It's just a guideline to go by. So try to think of it as that way. It's definitely not something that you could count on if, like Hob said, your generic E. coli was 12,000, you know, and you're a little bit below that 12,000 in 22, but I would still be very uncomfortable with relying on a 4-day die-off to control the hazard in that situation. Now, if my generic E. coli was 5,000, so I'm above that 3,800, that's a 3-day die-off, but well below the 12,000, it's a 4-day die-off, I would feel a lot more confident in using that water with a 4-day die-off. And then testing finished product is something you're going to see more in the manufactured food industry. They also do environmental monitoring, which is like swabbing your floor drains and stuff like that. So thankfully, those things are not required in the farm world. We need to keep it that way. I think if you get into some of the bigger audit standards, like the harmonized audit standard, you'll start to see some of those things. We'll see environmental monitoring, but there's just too much variability for produce sampling. And FDA does do some produce sampling for microbial quality, but it's not something that I've seen required. It's not required in a harmonized audit, but there might be some different audit standards out there that do require it. I just haven't run into them. So any other questions, just jump out at me. I'll run through these kind of scenarios for the ag water assessment. So basically ag water assessment is just knowing what water source and what you're using it for. So I have, like, I'll just go through one example. So there's a stream and you have to test 3 times for a gap audit. And so I tested the stream on June 8th, and it got 326 generic E. coli. On the 29th, it had more than 2,400 E. coli. And then on the 13th, it had less than 1 E. coli. And so I was using this water on cucumbers and summer squash, and the application method was drip irrigation. And so that's not likely to contact the part of the produce that people are eating. So the lowest risk application method. And so in this situation, I determined that the June 29th sample that was greater than 2,400 E. coli, you'll see that greater than symbol. If the generic E. coli count was so high that the lab wasn't able to count it anymore with the test that they were using. And so that's not saying that there was 2,420 E. coli there. There was definitely more. The lab just couldn't quantify it. They would have had to dilute the sample and test it again to try to get an accurate count. But in this pretend scenario, I said that that sample was pulled after a heavy rain event, which like churned up the stream. And so that's a very bad time to pull a water sample because it's not representative of when you're using it. So that will give you a false high E. coli count. And so I have a note in here that, usually if we've gotten a lot of rain, you're not irrigating. you don't need to irrigate your fields if there's been a lot of rain. And so I have a note in here that there was no harvest after the rain event until the 16th. And I had already resampled the water again to see that has less than 1 E. coli. And so that's basically a non-detect to 0 result. So probably a few more water samples should have been done in that scenario, but that's something that you might run into. I can run through some others or move on to templates. It's 6 o'clock, so I think I'll put this away. You guys, it was emailed to all of you. So if you go look through these scenarios and anybody has questions about them, you can just reach out to me via email or phone and I can help walk you through that. But I wanted to pull up some plans. I got that. Does anybody have like something that they're itching to see for records or templates, or holler out if you do? Otherwise, I'll just pull up some stuff that I have here. I think I'll go through records first because they're shorter.
The one thing I would say, Lindsay, which
Yep.
you will probably go over most of them, but since you mentioned that a training is one of the most important thing, let's just make sure that that one we show. And any SOPs, any documentation for sanitation would be nice as well to show.
Yeah, I'll go through some of the records real quick first. If my computer won't be so slow. It's just painful to bounce back and forth with sharing. I wanted to try to make a PDF of all of the records, but I don't have authorization to. They restrict our software like crazy. I only have Adobe Reader. So this is an example of a farm visitor policy. So a farm could just have this posted and that would meet the audit requirements for notifying visitors of your food safety policies. So I wanted to share that. It's just very basic. And like I said, that would meet the audit standard. And all of these, there's links on that sheet that I have. I don't know if I want to bother sharing that one. There's the list of all the resources. Here it is. So this got emailed out to everybody, and this goes with the template that I made. So it's got a list of what all the required records are, and then templates for the records. And so these are ones that I printed out for the in-person workshop. And so I'm going through some of these to show you examples right now. And then there's the food safety plan templates from the Food Safety Alliance website. So I went through and kind of listed the different templates and then what they are and a link to them. And I apologize, it seems like the links from the PDF are clickable, but I also saw an email from IT today saying that we were having Adobe problems in our state system. So if anybody wants a Word version of this document, I guess let me know and I can send you that so you can just click these links easier. But this is what I'm going through now for record templates. And so then a lot of farms will have a visitor policy, a login sheet rather. And so this is an example of one of those. And so the GAP audit manual for regular GAP does not actually require that you have all of your visitors sign in, but this is an easy way to kind of prove that you are notifying your visitors of your policies. So this example, you can write in your farm name, and then it has kind of like a checklist of expectations for visitors and then a place where visitors can sign in. This is like acknowledging that they read all the policies and will adhere to them. So an example of that. Next one is employee training, like Cobb requested. And there's a lot of, oh, that's not the one I wanted. Well, I'll just start with this one. So this one is from the California, what are they? Oh, it's the Community Alliance of Family Farmers. They're out of California. And so I like a lot of their resources that they have on their website. The link is on that sheet I showed a minute ago. And so this is just like a checklist that they put out for employee training topics. So it's going to look pretty similar to the one that I have in my packet. It's just a different format. And so if you don't like mine, maybe this one seems better to you. And so that's something that can be helpful to make sure that you don't forget anything when you're training your employees. And there's lots of spaces where you can write in additional topics that are specific to your farm. But traditionally, what I see for an employee training records is what Cornell uses. And Cornell is the one that does the GAPS program. And so they're the best place to go if you're getting resources for a GAP audit. But this is a worker training record template. And this is what I'll usually see, whether I'm doing a GAP audit or a produce safety rule inspection. So here we have, you can write in the name of your farm, the date that you did the training, who the trainer was, the time you did the training, and write in the topics that you covered. So this is how an auditor and inspector knows what you actually trained your employees on. And then you can just list, the printed name and signature of your employees on here. And it's the produce safety rule that requires records to be reviewed. So that's what you're seeing on the bottom there is the record review. So that's an example of a simple worker training record. I also have one more for employee training, a different version that's a little bit interesting to see. I encourage people to make their own rather than relying on these templates. Whoops, my bottom of the box disappeared. So this is another one from that California group, the CAFF. And so here they've got one training log with a bunch of topics that you could kind of check off, and then you can sign right below for the employees that were trained. And you can also write in the date and the trainers over there. And it just goes on to a second page with a lot more boxes for employees. So that's that one. Some other, I looked at the Cornell one. I show you a couple about cleaning equipment now. So this first one that I'm pulling up is a cleaning schedule that is required for a GAP audit. And I think this is another one from the CAFF, the Community Alliance Family Farm. So here you can see that they're listing out like different categories. Some are food contact surfaces like harvest knives, and some are, a delivery truck probably isn't a food contact surface, but still needs to be cleaned. Garbage cans, coal bins, the walk-in cooler. And so you can kind of map out the cleaning activities that happen on your farm, whether you're washing them or sanitizing them daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly. Some things are annually, like cleaning the condensers in the walk-in coolers, cleaning out the pans, the drain pans, and all that stuff might be something you do once a year. So that's an example of a cleaning schedule to try to keep yourself on track so nothing gets away from you. And an actual equipment cleaning record. I skipped around in my numbers. I'll use this one. So this one is from the Produce Safety Alliance, I believe. And so this would be the record of cleaning and sanitizing, specifically the food contact surfaces, because no record is required for cleaning the floor and stuff like that. So here you have the date that you did the cleaning, the time, what tool or equipment you were cleaning. And you could write in here, was it cleaned or was it sanitized or both? And put in some details about the method. So there's a lot of different methods of cleaning that are used depending on what's being cleaned. Some people aren't using detergent, and there's a lot of debate in the food safety world on if that's acceptable on farms. I see a lot of pressure washing with no use of detergent, possibly followed by a sanitizer application. But the regulation I enforce doesn't specifically say that you need to use detergent. The equipment just needs to be visually clean. So I'll accept just about any method of cleaning as long as it is visually clean and free of debris. And so you could write in here, maybe you use Simple Green to clean it, and maybe you use Sanidate to sanitize it. So those details are helpful. And then write who did the cleaning activity. So that's an example of what an equipment cleaning and sanitizing record would look like. I have so many of them. Here's the different one that I highlighted because I didn't like this one. And ironically, this is from the Community Alliance Family Farmed. So this is a general cleaning and sanitizing log. And again, they've got the date, the equipment. And here, I think it's just kind of silly that they have cleaned yes or no. So really, something that you're not cleaning is not going to be documented on a record. So this whole column here is just taking up space. So that doesn't need to be there. But sometimes, you know, you're cleaning a surface and you don't necessarily sanitize it every time. So this section right here is pretty useful. And then this record broke it up. So they have two different columns where you would enter the cleaner that you used, and a different column for the sanitizer that you used. And they made an awfully big box to write the name or initials of who did the cleaning activity. And so that's why I encourage farms to make their own records. It's helpful to look at a bunch of different ones and figure out what's going to work best for you. I have a bunch of other ones for pre-harvest assessment. I think this is something required by a GAP audit, and I think Linda's is my most favorite. And this is from Linda Titus, Ag Matters, who's retired now. And so she took this pre-harvest assessment right out of the GAP audit standard. And so it's like verbatim out of the standard for what you'd have to look at before you harvest. And so this isn't something that you would have to do every day before harvesting. This would be before you harvested for the first time in a field location. So if you're doing a GAP audit, the expectation is that you would have a record looking something like this for every single field location that you harvest from, as long as you want that on your GAP audit. So it's just a little checklist to run through. Field conditions are important because if it's been really wet, you're going to have higher microbial levels in the soil. If it's dry, there'll be less. And it's a checklist to make sure, you know, you have a toilet available for the employees that are going to be working in that field, and hand wash. Is there potable water, drinking water for the employees? Has there been any animal activity in the field where the crop has been potentially damaged, and what are you going to do about that? Any physical contamination? I've had hydraulic lines burst during audits. And so now you've got that fuel or hydraulic fluid all in the field, and what are you going to do about it? That's kind of on a different record than pre-harvest. But these are all things that you need to think about before you start harvesting in a location. So example of pre-harvest assessment. I should probably just keep sharing and slide up different things. A wildlife, oh no. Some of my PDFs won't open, and I saved them over here. I think it's because of that problem we're having with Adobe, and I haven't restarted my computer yet, but these templates are from Cornell, GAPS again, and so these are example, you don't have to do this. See, even these resources that are specific to GAP audits have all sorts of extra information that's not required. So there's no pre-plant animal activity assessment log requirement out of the GAP audit. So, but here they have a template for it, which would lead you to think that this is something required, but it's not. So we're going to scroll right past that one. But this is a sample wildlife and domesticated animal monitoring log. So this is something that you could be keeping. You could be keeping just a field notebook where you're writing down observations while you're out in the field throughout the growing season. So it's got the date when you did the observation, where you were, if you saw any animal activity, how significant it was. Was it a few deer tracks, or was like the lettuce field totally torn up and destroyed by a whole herd of deer or turkeys, something excessive? And then you could write in anything that you did, like maybe you were having trouble with migratory birds, so you put out a scarecrow or bird tape or a noise cannon, or what did you do to try to deter some of those animals is important for a gap audit. And a date that corrective actions that you took any of them, and who did the activity. And this is, nope, you do not need that one either for a gap audit. So just extra paperwork to scare people away. That nobody needs to do. And soil amendments, mock recall. Mock recall. This one is from the CAFF, and so this is an example of a mock recall record. And so if you do a gap audit, you have to go through this drill once a year to make sure that you are in practice in case you have something that you need to recall for real. So this having a traceability program is required for third-party audits. And so you need to know where the produce on your farm came from, like what field, what date was it harvested, and then who it was sold to. And so that's your responsibility in the grand traceability supply chain world out there. So this is an example of what a mock recall would look like. So you could call up Hannaford and say, hey, that shipment I sent you 3 days ago, how much of it do you still have in the store? Did you throw any of it away? Was it all sold to customers? That's what a mock recall is. And can you account for the entire order that was sold to that person? And what goes with the mock recall is the harvest log. And so this is an example from, I think this is from CAFF, yep. And so this is pretty common to see a harvest log. So you've got the day that you harvested, what crop you harvested, where you were, what field number, how much, the quantity, and then you've got like an individual unit. Do you break those up into bunches or boxes or a bulk bin? How is it sold? And then this record broke it out into different customers. So here they've got, did it go to the farmer's market? Did it go to the CSA? I don't know what WS is or RT or FS. These could be different buyers. Maybe they only sell to a few different buyers. They have a note here where they could add details about what CSA or farmer's market they were at. So the mock recall and this record this would cover the traceability requirements for an audit of where it came from, where it was harvested, and where it was sold to. And what else? Soil amendments, I think, are the last ones I have on here, and those are another PDF that will not open. So these are from Cornell Cows again. And so on your farm for soil amendments, if you're using compost that you composted yourself and you wanted to apply that while the crop was growing, you would have to make sure that that compost was adequately treated to be safe to apply while you're growing. And so this is a record you could keep to show that you adequately treated that compost. So it met the time temperature requirements to knock down the microbial levels that are in that compost. So you can make your own compost. You can apply it as raw. And if you want to apply it as treated, you would need a record like this showing that it's adequately treated. Some people don't want to keep that record, so they'll just apply all soil amendments as if they were raw. And that's where you definitely have to keep a soil amendment application record. So you're saying that this example would be for composted manure, and you can tell that this is treated because they have the date that it was applied, 5/2, May 2nd, and how much they used and everything, the date it was planted. So they applied it, they must have tilled it in, planted it, and then it was harvested 7/1. So that's only 2 months after application, which would not be adequate for raw manure. So if you're using anything raw that's untreated, it has to be applied 3 months or 4 months before harvest, depending on if the crop touches the soil or not. And so that's an example of a amendment record. I think I got through all of the record examples that I have, and it's 6:20. We've got 10 minutes left. Anybody, are there any more comments or questions? Anybody have a request for a template that they'd like to see for a plan?
A question just came through, Lindsay. Um, this person says, all of these monitoring log sheets, does the USDA get into detail on when the observations are a problem or needs corrective action? For example, the deer tracks observed and some plants eaten.
So yeah, I guess that would be more like, the food safety plans want you to document what you see. And so if you had some like deer droppings, there's different, like, depending on the crop that you are going to do, there's different actions that you might take. And so I had a carrot farmer asking me about this one time because they had a mechanical harvester and they were going to run it through the carrots. And so all of the best practices say that you're supposed to go through the field before you harvest and flag any areas with fecal matter, right? So that you don't harvest around that fecal matter. And this farmer was like, how can I do that? The equipment's huge and I can't move around flagged areas. And I was like, well, for your situation, the best thing that you could do is before you harvest is to walk the crop rows. And if you see that fecal matter, you have a shovel and get rid of it, right? And so if there's any crop around that fecal matter where, like, if you had rain and rain's potentially splashed off of that fecal matter onto the crop, like that crop shouldn't be harvested. So that's the kind of risk assessment you're doing when you're walking through the field seeing fecal matter. Is did it get onto the produce somehow? And if it did, it should not be harvested. And so you can either dispose of it, and then that way you can run the mechanical harvester through the field without navigating flagged areas. Or if you're manually harvesting, might be easier to flag areas where something like that happened, and just avoid them when you go through. The problem is sometimes people are harvesting several times, and so you can lose track of those areas if you don't flag them. So we don't really want, let's say it's deer droppings on strawberries. Deer droppings could have fallen through the strawberry bush. And so even though you can't see that the fecal matter contacted the strawberries, it still could have, as it's falling from the deer. So thinking kind of through all those different scenarios is a lot. And so that's why we're here to reach out if you have questions. But it's impossible to document every single scenario. So just saying that you did the pre-harvest assessment and removed any contaminated product or fecal matter is helpful. You could write a farm policy saying that that's what you guys do every time. I don't know if that helps.
Lindsay, he has a follow-up saying that like your answer is great and ask if this is written somewhere in USDA regulations and how do we know all of this? And I can help to try to answer. No, it's not written precisely like that. I know it's frustrating, but USDA, FDA for these regulations, they came with the kind of overarching goal of reducing risk. So they don't have a list. If you see this, do that. If you see this, do that, because I think that list would be too big and some things would never be covered because no one even thought about it. So they go the route of get some training like this, get some knowledge, try to think about some examples, do your best judgment. And I know it's frustrating because it's nice when you have a very prescriptive, when you see this, do that. But on the other hand, knowing that Lindsay is the inspector in the state and she's using the approach of helping to educate while regulate, she understands there's some flexibility, and if she ever goes there to do an inspection and she can, and I'm not talking for you, Lindsay, let me know if I'm saying something wrong. If she can tell that you are doing all you can to the best of your ability, she will probably be happier than if you didn't do anything or you didn't think about it. So no, there's no specific language like that. They mostly talk about minimizing risk in all these realms and only give some basic food safety concepts that you can use, like when you do a training, some of the concepts you can use to come up with your own rules in one way.
Thanks, Hob. Yeah, there's just nobody wants to commit to a guarantee, right? So nobody ever wants to say this is safe in this scenario because there's so many different situations and so many different variables, especially on a farm. And so you're never going to see anything laid out that black and white for these different things. And so just to go back to really doing the best that you can and at least thinking about the risks on your farm and making an attempt to, you know, try to control, just being aware is probably the most powerful thing that you can do. And if you're aware and doing the best you can, making some kind of an effort, you're going to be in really pretty good shape. It's people that are willfully negligent that are going to run into trouble with the regulatory world. So that's really what we're going after. I'm not looking to nitpick people to death. Gap audits get a little bit like that just by the nature of the audit questions, because to me it's like tunnel vision. Like I'm restricted to these audit questions and they're very detailed. But when I'm on a farm inspection, I'm looking at the big picture. I would much prefer doing an inspection because I'm doing a risk assessment of your farm and really looking for those bigger things or hazards on your farm that could get amplified and make a lot of people sick when your produce goes to market. Those are the things I'm looking for. But yeah, I don't know where else to go with that. I hope that helps. Like I said, I'm here, Hobbs here, and so if you run into some situations where you can't find any specific thing, you can just reach out and we'll talk it through with you off the record. Like, even though I'm an inspector, I talk to enough people and see enough farms that I'll never remember we had the conversation, so it will never come back to you. I just don't operate that way anyways. So yeah, we're always here. If there's something that you're just not quite confident the best way to deal with it, I'm happy to help that way.
Thank you so much to you both, and you're getting some thank yous in the comments and chat too.
Awesome.
Any last question to round us out? Please feel free to say the word. I will also here
Yeah.
put a little poll up for our participants. If you don't mind taking a moment, we appreciate it, and our grant funding appreciates it when you fill these out.
Yes, please do the poll. And yeah, this an hour and a half is pretty quick to go through templates, but if anybody has any questions looking at the templates from that sheet that went out with the email, just feel free to give me a call. I'm happy to give you my 2 cents and make recommendations and help guide you in any way that I can.
Same here.
Thank you both so much for being here on this sunny afternoon. Thank you to everyone for being here on this sunny afternoon. And just as a reminder, our next class is coming right up Monday, April 28th on agricultural water assessment. So hopefully we'll see some of you there as well.
Thank you, Anna. And I don't have anything pressing, so if people want me to stay on a little bit later unrecorded to answer questions, I'm happy to do so.
Let me pause the recording here in that case, or stop the recording, one sec.